From third-degree tactics to torture, through psychological persuasion and now to science-based interviewing, interrogation practices and research have changed drastically over the last several decades. In this episode, we're going to highlight the recently published paper from Law and Human Behavior on Police-Induced Confessions with two of the leading scholars in this field. What works to get people to talk? What increases the risks of false confessions? How can we be better communicators? All these topics and more on this episode of Truth Be Told.
This is the Truth Be Told podcast, where we unlock the secrets of strategic communication.
I'm lucky to be joined today by two guests, Dr. Hayley Cleary and Dr. Christian Meissner. Hayley is an associate professor of criminal justice and public policy at Virginia Commonwealth University. She earned BAs with distinction in psychology and Russian studies from the University of Virginia, a master of public policy from Georgetown University, and a PhD in developmental psychology from Georgetown University. Her research examines adolescent behavior and decision-making in the legal system context. The cornerstone of her research program is police interrogation, in particular, the interrogation of youthful subjects. Chris is a professor of psychology at Iowa State University, where he directs the Applied Cognition Laboratory. He holds a PhD in cognitive and behavioral science from Florida State University. His research uses experimental methodologies to examine cognitive, psychological processes in forensic, military, and human intelligence settings, including strategies that facilitate the disclosure of information and the assessment of credibility in interviews and interrogations. Both Hayley and Chris have been reliable partners in the field of interview and interrogation research and practice. To learn more about both of our guests, check out the link in the show notes. Let's get to the discussion on the scientific review paper about police-induced confessions. Welcome to this episode of the Truth Be Told podcast. I am Dave Thompson. I am here with two esteemed guests. I have Dr. Hayley Cleary and Dr. Chris Meissner joining me to share some of their expert wisdom when it comes to the research behind interview, interrogation techniques, and false confessions. So thank you all both for joining me today for our conversation.
Thank you.
I know we're going to dive into really the biggest topic of the day is a recent white paper. I'm going to read it to make sure I don't have the title wrong, but Police-Induced Confessions 2.0, Risk Factors and Recommendations. And you are two of the authors on it, and want to just highlight some of the other authors that weren't joining us today, but Saul Casson, we got Gislika Johnson, Richard Leo, Allison Redlick, and Kyle Scher. What just a really cool group of people that put together this paper. And the reason I say a cool group is because especially the two of you have just shown such an outstanding ability to work with the practitioner community when it comes to putting research together and how it applies in the field.
Say, Dave,
and we're going to get to all of that, but I have a question what do you mean by that?
It's the only way. I mean, I knew nothing or little about how interviews or interrogations worked until I started working with those who do it professionally. We learn from them, right? And so it's critical. It's just critical. We can unpack that.
Yeah, I think that is probably music to practitioners' ears that are listening. Is a lot of times, there's importance in lab research, but experimental research, or at least listening to practitioners and what they deal with, is so important. And that's what we're hoping to convey today: is how this research applies to those in the field, so how we can all be better at our jobs. But I am curious, before we get into all the findings that you all had, what got each of you interested in this topic in the first place? And you might have to go back a few years ago, but what drove your interest in police interrogations and or false confessions?
Go ahead, Hayley. Kick us off.
All right. Well, we do have to go all the way back to graduate school. I was studying developmental psychology and adolescent development in particular, and I was always interested in how youth and their families navigate the criminal legal system. So whether that was in a policing context or in the courtroom or in a correctional setting. And I started reading the works of, people like this guy named Chris Meissner, this guy named Saul Casson, and I was fascinated by this idea that, the potential consequences of the outcome of a custodial or even a non-custodial interaction with a police officer are potentially lifelong. And I'm learning all this stuff about adolescent development and their, limited capacities for self-regulation and their, struggles with impulse control, things that are developmentally normative or typical or expected, And I began thinking about, well, might this create some vulnerabilities in the interrogation room? And at that time, Alison Redlick, who's another one of the SRP authors, was doing work in this space. She's also a developmental psychologist, but there really wasn't much attention around youth-specific issues, at least in the U.S., right? Gislika Johnson, another author, has been doing this work in Europe for decades. So I just became fascinated by this idea that, this interaction happens largely behind closed doors. At that time, most states weren't recording, or many states weren't recording. And so, I became curious about what happens with young people in particular when they are questioned by police.
That's awesome. That's awesome. But she wasn't reading my papers way back then. It was Saul, really.
Oh, most certainly was.
Well, I'm
age
going to
reference,
continue
maybe.
with that because as the kids,
I was in the fifth
as the
grade,
kids
no.
say, I went to college back in the 1900s, and and back then,
You're right.
I became enamored with Saul Kassen's work. I mean, just his seminal papers on confessions and the book that he and Larry Reitzman wrote on confessions were pivotal readings for me. And let me go back a little bit more because I want to give a shout out to somebody, Susan Kirkendall. I went to a liberal arts college, and I thought I wanted to go to law school. Susan Kirkendall, professor new to my university, Pfeiffer University, came in and learned of my and other students' interests, and asked us, would you be interested in taking a psychology and law course? And I thought to myself, what the heck is that? Never heard of that, but that's fascinating. Yes, please. 5 of us, and she taught it like a grad seminar. I mean, I didn't know it at the time, but Larry Reitzman's books and articles each week, including papers by Saul and Larry and others, that really introduced me to the field. And that's really kicked me off. So I always want to say thank you to Susan. Went to grad school, and my advisor, Jack Brigham, brought in Saul Kassen to give a talk. And it was that experience with Saul. I spent a day and a half or 2 days with Saul, had some wonderful opportunities to just pick his brain and talk about ideas. And we ended up collaborating together. I went off to my first job, and it just started a wonderful and really pivotal collaboration for me.
What a evolution. Talking about psychology and law, there happened to be a little conference that you were running a couple weeks ago.
I wasn't running it. We had fantastic people running it. But I was really happy to contribute, and I hope you all had a great time.
Yeah, absolutely. I know, Chris, you mentioned this before, and I just want to explore this concept of working with practitioners because I mentioned you both have done a good job of this. I know Chris has done a lot with the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group and out there working with and training a lot of federal agencies, which is really interesting. Hayley's been stuck with me on a couple different projects, but she's also, both of you have spoken at Elite Training Day in front of an International Association of Interviewers. I know Hayley's worked with a whole bunch of departments and practitioners and even leveraging technology, some virtual reality stuff, all just really cool. But what is the true value and I guess the way in which you approach a practitioner? And just to frame what I'm kind of asking here, is a lot of times when people from the academic community enter a police department and knock on the door and say, hey, can we have some of your data? Can we shadow what you're doing and examine it? Because we're probably going to tell you it's wrong. That's the perspective. So how do you manage those relationships, and what's the value?
I think the first and foremost thing to do is acknowledge that perception exists, and for good reason. I mean, there are many academics who have come before us who have, perhaps inadvertently laid the foundation for that perception, and I think it's justified in a lot of respects. And so the number one quality that I think academics should embody when they come into these interactions is humility, right? Especially when it comes to a really context-specific interaction like a police interrogation, right? We are not law enforcement officers. I have never conducted an interrogation, and I probably never will. I'm not qualified to do so. And so I do know a lot about science and research and the scientific method and how we can learn things about how systems work. But when it comes to understanding how things operate in practice and also a source for the best research questions, you go straight to the source. And so I love working with practitioners, investigators, because they know what's happening in real life and they can tell me what's important, right? What I should be studying, what kinds of questions that I can apply my skills to help them do their
I
jobs
just love it
better.
when practitioners say that would never happen in the real world, right? But wait a minute, I've seen it on movies. I believe this is how it happens. No, that would never happen. I learned so much from those experiences. I should note my father was a law enforcement officer. He ended his career as captain and short stint as deputy chief, and spent 30 plus years there, and went to the state attorney's office after that for a decade. And it was really his kind of living through him early on that I became fascinated with law enforcement and law. My uncle is an attorney, private attorney, but worked at the state attorney's office as well. So I was kind of raised in this family of law, and I've always been fascinated by it. In that context too, I grew up understanding that cops were my friend, and I really appreciate the opportunities to build on those friendships. And it's been difficult, as Hayley said. There's a perception, I think, that it's us versus them, which I work to dispel. You mentioned the HIG research program. Susan Brandon set that up 2010, and I worked with her early on to kind of push out and develop the research program. She and I spent a lot of time on the road in those first 5 years, visiting different agencies and training cadre. And our philosophy was always to go in there with humility, to never go in there with answers, to only go in there inviting questions and seeking collaboration. It was never a point where we wanted to tell them how to do their job, but rather we wanted to partner with them and learn from them. And in fact, I would say the best HIG research that we produced involved collaborations. It involved taking things from the lab into the field and really through the training academies. And it's those collaborations with training cadre and with federal agencies and state and local agencies that allowed us to do that. Just really crucial to go through that process. If I can I take a point of privilege here? To just say,
Absolutely.
I hear a lot of folks saying, well, the only way to do research is to do it in the field. You have to do it in the real world. But I'm an experimental psychologist by training. I do and started all of my research in the lab. And there's crucial things that we learn in the lab and that we can do in the lab that allow us to understand why things work and how they work before they get into the field. Let me just draw this analogy for you. Medicine today wouldn't be possible if we only studied what doctors did in the field, right? They'd be practicing largely the same way they practiced 40 or 50 years ago. How does medicine, scholarship arrive at practice? It starts in the lab with very basic work, and it's systematically translated from the lab to the field. And it takes many different types of researchers and scholars to make that happen. None of us can do it all. So I hope that practitioners will begin to appreciate the value of laboratory work, not because it has direct application at that moment, but because it informs us of the processes that lead to best practice. And understand that there's a process for moving it from the lab to the field.
That is such a critically important point. And it's something that, we get challenged with a lot. And I think Chris's message, which is directly on point, sometimes gets lost in translation. I mean, you see criticisms of the SRP itself, but especially the work contained within it. And the criticisms always hone in on lab research, right? That, a mock interrogation in the lab is not the same thing as a real criminal investigation. Well, of course not. But it does allow us to understand the mechanisms, right? Like Chris said, the how and why things work that then get translated to the real world or applied to, field research to see how to follow sort of the research process throughout it in continuity. And Chris's work, just to lift up Chris's work, he has really been a leader in this field, right? And has specific pieces of scholarship directly around this is how we translate how we've moved the Higg research, like from the lab right into the field and tested it in the field. So both of those components are really important. No conclusion that we make as the authors of this scientific review paper rest on a single article, lab or field or otherwise, but it's the totality of the research and what we learn from the triangulation of all of these studies that helps us better understand how interrogation processes work, how they relate to outcomes, both
Yeah, I'll just say
and
too that
inaccurate.
we involve practitioners not only in our field work and our translational work, but also in our laboratory work. They help us develop scripts. They are the ones that are creating stimuli for us if we're recording stimuli and presenting that to people. So involving the practitioner from the beginning is what I see as critical.
And now I'm going to take a point of privilege and call out Dave because he's been incredibly helpful to my work in that regard. So I'm doing some work with virtual reality to study interrogations in a virtual environment. And I involved him from the beginning. I said, here's a script that I wrote that is intended to be carved out in these kind of systematic ways. I masked that script so he didn't know what I was aiming for and gave it to him and said, how does this read to you? Is this showing fidelity to the actual practices and how they operate? And I made changes based on his feedback before we collected any data. And that was incredibly valuable input that directly impacted the stimulus, which directly impacted my data collection, which directly impacted my conclusions.
Which I will tell you, in that experience for practitioners listening, we learned so much in that process as well. Because as a practitioner or somebody who's training other practitioners, a lot of times we don't realize what it is that we're doing, right? It's, hey, I said this one thing in the interview and it happened to work. Or I think I developed rapport and it happened to result in this, but we don't really know what that looks like on a more grander scale. And that's what this research is helpful to do. And Chris, you gave the kind of medicine example. I presented at a conference a couple of weeks ago and brought up some medical solutions from decades ago of like cocaine being, prescribed for hay fever and cigarettes for asthma and all this kind of crazy stuff. And to me, when it comes to interviewing, and regardless of your role of who's listening, if you just went to a class 30 years ago or learned on the job 20 years ago and aren't looking at the current research, that you're still prescribing cocaine for some element. And so I think that was a really interesting kind of translation. And so speaking of that, right, over the changes over the last, decades, I know the last white paper was about, 10 years, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So a lot's changed in that time frame. But even before that, maybe just a real high level of kind of the U.S. landscape of what police interrogation maybe looked like, and then where we were before you kind of started to look at the current status. So just maybe a history lesson if one of you want to
Start us
provide
out, Hayley.
such.
No, I was about to say, I think you're much better positioned to talk about the transition from accusatorial
Well,
to
it's
information gathering
it's
approaches.
a challenge, right? To shift practice over time. But certainly when the first white paper came out, there was a decided focus on accusatorial practices in the US. And it was largely those confrontational, theme-based approaches that were being used in most departments, even at the federal level, and especially at the federal level. What I think's happened in the interim is we've learned not only more about why those techniques are problematic and in what ways they're problematic, but we've also learned more about what actually works in interviews. And I want to just underscore the paper, the scientific review paper, isn't the end of the research journey for this area. It's a continuation and an update of what's happening. We've learned a great deal on best practice over the past decade. We've learned about the value of rapport, and we're learning more today about the value of trust and how that's different from rapport. We've learned the importance of keeping an open mindset and not allowing biases to invade. We've learned about how best to present evidence strategically and in ways that elicit more conversation, engagement, and ultimately confessions. We've learned more about how to strategically interview to assess credibility. But we're not done. And I want to underscore this point. Innovation will continue to happen. And I always like to say when I do a training or I give a talk to practitioners, I hope that in 5 years or 10 years, you'll invite me back and I can update you on the latest of what we know and the latest innovations and best practices. Because let's go back to the medicine example. Every year, we're learning about new drugs, new treatments, new ways of rehabilitating individuals, new devices that facilitate all of that. And I really believe that interviewing shouldn't be any different. I believe over time that training programs should be continually updating their programs based on what we know now is best practice. And I hope that this podcast and these opportunities for conversation with larger audiences really encourages practitioners to reach out and to engage with the scholars and to look for those innovations or be part of the process that we've been talking about today.
It reminds me of one of the many things that I think scientists and investigators have in common, which is we're curious people, right? Scientists are always asking questions, and so are investigators. We just do it in different ways, kind of toward different goals. And so, if we sit down and have conversations with one another with an open mind and, talk about our shared goals and shared values, which is, something that you and I have done in our previous work, Dave, I think we'll realize that we do have a lot in common, and curiosity is a really big part of that. And, to your medical example, about, let's say, smoking cigarettes being prescribed for asthma. That was doctors doing the prescribing, right? Based on the scientific knowledge at the time. They weren't, pulling that out of nowhere. But the science has evolved and will continue to evolve. And that's just how science works, right? We rarely solve the problem. It's at least in the social sciences, right? Where we're basically trying to explain human behavior, which is the hardest thing in the world the hardest problem to solve. So it is very much a journey, not the destination kind of situation, which is why ongoing training and ongoing research and discovery will always be the case.
I think, and you both have just mentioned this, it's important that people, especially in this paper, because some research that I've found when it comes to interrogations or false confessions is a lot about what not to do or what doesn't work. But Chris, you started to list some of these, and we'll get to this in a little bit, but there's a ton of recommendations on what does work. And what I found in the practitioner world is if you take a tool away from somebody, you need to be able to replace it with something else. And I feel like the research has definitely done that. And I'll also tell people, we keep mentioning this paper, we'll have it's linked in the show notes. So if you want to go through and look at the specific literature review yourself, and read some of these findings, it's all there available for you. But I'm curious, I'm sidetracked for 1 second. We got some people that listen that don't do any interviews or any interrogations in their mind. They don't. Have either of you in the research or in your experience found that any of this applies in your personal life or professional life outside of
It's really funny that
an
you asked that,
interrogation?
because fundamentally what we teach is human communication. Everything that we know that works is fundamental to human engagement and interpersonal interactions, one-on-ones, right? And it's not uncommon. I remember a training that we did in Arizona, where I always encourage practitioners, what we're training you today, I want you to practice it this evening. I want you to give somebody a call. I want you to go home to your partner. I want you to engage with your kids. It doesn't matter who it is. Practice the skills, because the only way that you get better is by practicing the skills. And we had several folks that did that. But one in particular came back the first night and said, I did this with my wife, and she looked at me cross-eyed. And what are you doing? What's going on here? What are they teaching you? This is not you. He kept at it, though. The second night, She kind of looked at him a little sideways, but engaged with him. By the third night and the fourth night, she said, I don't know what they're teaching you, but you need to keep it up. And he actually took us to dinner the last night. And he said, you know what? I just want to thank you all because you've changed my marriage. You've changed fundamentally the way that I interact with my wife, my partner. And I really think that the techniques that we know work are very powerful for building relationships and engaging, allowing people the autonomy and the space to talk and to show them that they're being heard in that moment. And Hayley's work, let me call out Hayley's work, shows that, in fact, fundamentally, one of the reasons people provide a confession to something that they did is because the interviewer showed them respect and gave them an opportunity to talk and be heard. It's fundamental communication. Hayley.
And it's fundamental human communication. That's exactly right. And social scientists have been studying this idea. It goes by many names, right? We call it procedural justice. We call it voice. We've been studying it in different contexts for a while now, but are now more sort of deliberately and intentionally bringing that theoretical and empirical work to the interrogation context. And it really is about fundamental human communication. And we're all psychologists. All of us on the scientific review paper are psychologists. We study individual human behavior and decision making. And it really is widely applicable. I mean, you asked about whether and how this is useful to non-investigators. I mean, I have 11 and 7-year-old sons. And if I have learned anything in the last few years, it's that I interact with them in a guilt presumptive way more than I recognized. And I have confirmation bias when I, have expectations about, what they've done or what they're not telling me. I have learned the value of empathy. Right. And I'm a developmental psychologist. I'm supposed to know these things. But in the moment, it's really easy to forget, which why I think training is super, super important so that these skills become commonplace and they almost become routinized. Right. So we default to these good communication skills instead of defaulting to our guilt presumptive and confrontation.
I'll just say that I'm not sure anything works with a 16-year-old daughter, but I continue to try. I really do.
That you're going to revert back to the enhanced interrogation techniques we've worked to eradicate. I asked that question because those are great examples. We hear from a lot of people in training or that listen to this on similar to Chris, what you said, hey, this helped me in my personal relationship, or a lot of salespeople, right? This helped me, communicate better, learn better from a potential client or a buyer. And we've given this example before, but to me, kind of the accusatorial or confrontational, emotionally pressuring tactic is kind of like if you buy a car and you feel like you got talked into it, and afterwards, maybe you bought the car, afterwards you regret that decision, and you're probably not going to go back to that salesperson again because they've damaged the relationship. I would rather the salesperson hear me out, understand what I'm looking for, not looking for. Even if they don't get the sale today, I'm probably going to trust them to refer to friends, and I'm probably going to go back to them when I'm in need at a later time. And so I just, that parallel comes up all the time. And I think you guys talked about this in the paper about the weight of a confession, how much that impacts either other evidence, maybe the perceptions of the investigator or a jury. And I think as we go into kind of the recommendations and the positive, it's important for people to understand how crazy it is that a confession can just contaminate everything else in a case. And the end of this, I feel like, is we need to get away from confession seeking conversations and more, you both mentioned this, how do we just keep the conversation going, right? Change the goal of the interview. But I don't know if you guys could expand maybe on what you found, what the literature has found on the weight of a confession as compared to other evidence.
Yeah, I mean, as the saying goes, you can't unring the bell, right? Once an investigator or certainly a judge or a jury is aware of a confession, or even a forensic scientist who's analyzing DNA data and comes to learn that a confession was involved from the suspect whose DNA they're testing, right? The psychological effects are very, very powerful. And there are a lot of sort of fundamental underlying psychological principles that help explain that. But at the end of the day, it's just really hard to dissociate the idea that someone would confess to particularly a heinous or violent crime that they didn't actually commit, especially if they are seeing it on video, right? They're hearing it in the suspect's own words. And so that is why the procedures that investigators use to obtain that confession are absolutely essential, so that we can have more faith in that final product and the veracity of that.
Let's talk about the role of the kind of guilt mindset and how it actually plays a part of the interrogation itself, right? What happens when I go into a conversation with someone believing something about them? Well, it fundamentally changes the way that I interact with them. And in fact, in many cases, it leads me to ask questions or engage with them in ways that confirm my initial belief. We call this behavioral confirmation. That process plays out, that basic fundamental social psychological process plays out in the interrogation room as well. If I believe that someone is guilty, I treat them differently. I question them differently. I am more likely to conduct longer, more pressure-filled interrogations. I'm going to be asking questions in ways that confirm my beliefs. And ultimately, research has shown you're more likely to get a confession, particularly from an innocent person, if you go in believing that they're guilty of that. One of the fundamental things we have to change is that focus on the confession and the focus on a perception of guilt. We'd rather that investigators brought in an investigative mindset, right? That curiosity, that openness to learning, that seeking information. And really, I like to talk about two goals of an interrogation. One, winning their cooperation to get engagement. And two, eliciting investigatively relevant information. Not a confession, investigatively relevant information. Sometimes that information is going to confirm what you know. Sometimes that information is going to disconfirm what you know. I think as an investigator, you have to be open to both because you don't know everything. Your evidence tells you part of the story. It doesn't tell you the whole story. You have to be open.
Yeah, there's so much value with that. It triggers me to the beginning of most of our training classes. We will ask a question of practitioners, whether law enforcement or private sector, whoever, what is the goal of an interview? You know, this is before we sit there for 2 days or 3 days or 5 days. And often you'll hear things like a confession, a conviction, termination, prosecution, whatever. And changing the mindset to, if the goal, I like what you said, Chris, is the goal of cooperation, and let's just get as much information as possible. And I go back to the car example, which I don't know if it's the right one to use, but I think about if my goal is I need to hit a number of sales today and how many vehicles I need to sell. That puts pressure on me as the interviewer to only achieve that result. That pressure is going to be relayed to the consumer, and they're going to feel resistance or my desperation. If instead my goal was, I want to build a relationship with 5 customers that stay in touch with me and get more information, I might find out that customer has 2 siblings that are also in the market for vehicles. I might find out their kid is about to turn 16 and also needs a car. And when I think about it in an interview or interrogation, if you guys can expand on this, you know, if we have an investigation into an arson, for example, if the goal is to find out this one person started the one fire, right, or that's a confession, if instead we build cooperation and we have a conversation, we might find out this person's responsible for 4 other arsons, or there's 3 other, accomplices involved. So does that, I guess, analogy make sense? And is that what the research has found is to be more effective?
100%. You don't know what you don't know. And being open allows for and facilitates communication. Being open reduces resistance and reactance, right? When you go in with an accusatorial mindset and you speak that into existence, right? You show behaviors and emotions that confirm that belief. Nobody wants to engage with you. In fact, you're creating resistance and reactance. You're working against yourself in that moment. And because you don't know exactly what happened, they may, in fact, be responsible for this crime, as you say. They may also be party to or responsible for other crimes. And I think my colleague and collaborator, Steve Kleinman, Colonel Steve Kleinman, U.S. Air Force, has an intelligence background and worked with a variety of three-letter agencies. He always learns to approach this from an intelligence mindset. And I think that's exactly right. You're seeking to evaluate the intelligence that they're going to offer you, which may speak to the present case, but may also speak to other cases that you didn't know were out there, right? And so having that kind of networked intelligence mindset is really critical.
And it calls for humility also. I mean, we talked about humility among scientists, and investigators, I think, have to be willing to acknowledge, hey, I don't have the whole story. The evidence I have is just a piece of the story. That's why I'm conducting this investigation and or this interview. What else can I learn? And that requires all of us to sort of recognize our biases and set them aside, to understand that biases are not a character flaw. They're a part of human cognition. We all have them. I have them, you have them. We all have biases in different ways. The best we can do is be aware of them, understand how they operate, and just continually try to keep ourselves in check as much as possible, right? So like I'm teaching my students, when I teach them statistics, for example, and we conduct these analyses and we interpret our findings and we form conclusions about those findings, I teach my students to kind of stress test their conclusions. Like, what are all of the ways that I could be wrong, right? This is how we appropriately warrant our claims in science so that we can be as sure or as comfortable as possible that what we're interpreting is the truth. And I think investigators go through the same process, or should go through the same process, right? What are the conclusions that I'm drawing about this suspect, about their guilt, about their history, about how their criminal history might affect their current behaviors? And what are all of the ways that I could be wrong, right? That's how I think part of cultivating that open mindset.
Yeah, I think, and as you guys are both talking about this, we're not saying confessions are a bad thing, right? If you get that information, fantastic. The lesson for me is to be aware of how much that either seeking a confession is going to alter the entire interaction, and secondly, if you do obtain a confession or some type of disclosure, how much that can impact, to Hayley, what you were just saying, the bias that you and everybody else involved in the case, the weight that has. And I hate reading, but I like reading, but I hate reading on the podcast. But I can't tell two
I was
professors.
about to
But
say, we can't be
yeah,
friends
don't worry,
anymore.
I corrected. But I just want to read two sentences from this section of the paper, because a lot of times when we talk about these things, like the confession can contaminate our opinion. Investigators listen and say, okay, maybe somebody watching a true crime documentary, if they see a confession, that impacts their opinion, but I'm an expert, not me. So I'm going to highlight these because I'm sure you didn't memorize all of the research that you cited in the 48-page paper. So I'll just hopefully remind you. But this is referring to how confessions corrupt other evidence. Israeli police force polygraph examiners perceived more deception in polygraph charts when they believed the suspect had confessed than in a no confession control condition. So we've got some experts, right, polygraphers, that had a difference of opinion based off of what their assumption was or knowledge of. And then the second piece, in another study, this one was Dror and Charlton, 2006, presented 5 fingerprint experts with pairs of prints from a crime scene and a suspect in an actual case in which they previously made a match or exclusion judgment. The prints were accompanied by no other information, an instruction the suspect either had confessed or that the suspect was in custody. And that had a change in 17% of the previously correct judgment. So people were essentially changing their mind based off if they realized there was a confession present or not. And so I think that's just really powerful to see these experts who are in the field every day also were contaminated by a confession. And I think what people may not realize is how much, and you can all help inform us, how much you think that's happening in the real world today, where a medical examiner, a forensic expert, somebody maybe has an opinion and then is informed, oh, by the way, they confessed, and that opinion may or may not change. Have either of you experienced that?
Of course. And it happens every day, hundreds of thousands of times a day, because we're fundamentally human. And it doesn't matter if we're an expert or we're a novice, right? We're all susceptible to this. Our prior beliefs guide the way that we look for evidence, weight the evidence, and ultimately make a decision. And it's fundamental to who we are as humans. It's a real challenge to try to overcome biases. And there are some debiasing techniques that have been talked about and investigated out there. One of the ones that we often talk about is considering the opposite, or listing reasons for why one outcome might happen versus another outcome might happen, right? It requires effort to override these fundamental biases. And it's a challenge for all of us. But it's something that, given the stakes of these interviews and interrogations, it's critical that investigators approach this with that kind of mindset, one that they're willing to exert the extra energy and effort required to consider the opposite and list reasons for why one outcome versus another outcome might occur.
I think that would be high on my list of, where I would like to see the field going in the next decade or so, right? And that's an area that I think that's a logical next step for the research in this field. Like, we know these biases exist. We're learning more and more about how they operate in legal and criminal context. So how can we as scientists study these debiasing techniques, come up with new debiasing techniques, drawing inspiration from other fields, from people in the real world, and test them and further to develop them so that we can continue adding tools to investigators' toolboxes.
I have had a guest on season 1. We had Dr. Jeff Kukuka, who you both know, who talked a lot about biases. Yeah, great episode to listen to. And then we also had Hayley. You just mentioned other fields. We had Anna Papalia, who's an expert in human resources, talent management, and interviewing when it comes to candidate interviews. And it's funny, as you're saying this, I'm remembering that conversation, and she was talking about the research that if you have a candidate for a job where their resume looks great, maybe they got referred to you by a colleague, maybe they went to the same school you went to, we tend to ask questions to put them in a more favorable light in the job interview, and then conversely the opposite. And so, again, as you both mentioned, I think this research directly relates to so many other fields. Before, I want to make sure we get to some of these recommendations, because obviously that's really the impact here, is not just here's stuff we learned, but it's how can we be better, more efficient. But it would be, we'd be amiss if we didn't at least cover briefly some of the risk factors that also exist, because I think whatever interview and communication technique you use, there's in the paper you list situational and dispositional risk factors that may put people at higher risk, or suggestibility could be more powerful with people like that. I know Hayley does a lot of work, especially with developmental maturity issues. And so there's a few on here. I'm just going to rattle off a few, and then if you guys just want to speak to how this kind of relates in the interview. But things like presentations of false evidence, I know is still a highly contested topic, and something that I support getting rid of that tactic across the country. The U.S. is a little behind in that, and we can speak to that. Using things like minimization or suggestion of leniency, and then some of the personal risk factors. You guys listed neurodevelopmental disorders, psychopathology, trauma, just life experience and adversity, of course, developmental immaturity, which some people might just confuse with age as a number. And if I say that to Hayley, we'll have 2 hours just on that topic. But I think all of these are really important for people to know about. So maybe if you guys could just expand on what is the importance of understanding these risk factors as an interview.
Why don't I speak to maybe the dispositional risk factors broadly? So, in general terms, there are conditions or characteristics that some folks may have that might put them at elevated risk for coercion, for susceptibility to suggestive influence, and ultimately to saying or admitting to something that they didn't actually do. And, this is one area where the research has really advanced tremendously since the first scientific review paper. So if you compare the two papers side by side, some of the risk factors are the same, right? And developmental immaturity is one example. So that appears in both places, both papers, but now we know more about why. And that's that sort of basic science that Chris was talking about earlier. So the field of developmental neuroscience, for example, has really, really exploded over the last few decades. And we've learned more about what's happening at a neurobiological level that causes or drives those immaturity-related vulnerabilities. We've learned more about different neurodevelopmental disorders, intellectual disability, ADHD. these, psychopathology refers to specific types of mental illnesses. So we're learning more about the mechanisms through which these particular conditions or characteristics cause vulnerability. And these are all things that investigators should be aware of, right? As SRP authors, we're not saying if you have an intellectual disability, you're automatically going to give a false confession, right? We're not saying that if you are a young person, you're automatically vulnerable to coercion, because there are vast individual differences even within groups of folks who have these characteristics. But what we're saying is research is quite clear that as a whole or as a group, people who have these characteristics show increased levels of risk for various reasons. And that's something that investigators, as part of their interview preparation process, should try to learn as much as possible about, so that they can take the appropriate steps to provide extra supports or to put different protections in place to make sure that the information that they are eliciting from that person is accurate and reliable.
When it comes to situational factors or vulnerabilities, you mentioned false presentation of evidence and minimization themes, for example. Both have been shown in the research to increase the likelihood of a false confession by more than 3 times. And so we know that these things are drivers of false confessions. And we also know that they're exacerbated when those individual characteristics that Hayley just talked about are present. So what's the alternative to these? There are alternative ways to present evidence truthfully but strategically, right? And there are alternative ways of developing rapport, seeking to reduce resistance and create opportunities for conversation. There are opportunities also to present and to confront in what I like to call a constructive way. It requires rapport and trust as the foundation, but it places the evidence on the table and asks the subject to address an inconsistency, for example, between their statements and the evidence in a manner that facilitates understanding and allows the interviewer to continue to question the subject about the evidence and about their statement. We're learning more every day, right? Innovation is going to continue to happen. And there are, as you say, Dave, we can't take away a tool and not provide a tool. And I think one of the things that's changed in the past 10 years from the first scientific review paper to the second is our ability now to specifically point to practices that not only facilitate cooperation and engagement, but facilitate the collection of investigative information. And as you say, we're not giving up on confessions. Most importantly, these techniques drive diagnostic confessions. In some studies, they increase the likelihood of a true confession, while simultaneously reducing dramatically the likelihood of a false confession. I'd say that's a win-win for everybody.
Yeah, it seems like a no-brainer, right? But the open-minded to embrace a new approach or philosophy, which is what I want to wrap us up with. Is I know the paper has, I think, 7 different remedies that you kind of summarize and suggest. I want to highlight a few, and I recommend people review the paper yourselves, because there's so much great information in here and some really interesting studies. And then if you have a problem like me, you'll start to see the studies that you all cite, and then you'll end up reading hundreds of pages of research on this. But what I think some of the ones that were really stuck out to me on what can practitioners do differently, or at least where are we headed, and what are some of the suggestions that you recommend, one of which was called evidence-based suspicion.
Yeah, what we're talking about is looking to reduce the likelihood that an innocent person is subjected to an interrogation. There's now decades of research looking at innocence as a risk factor. That is to say, innocent individuals who come into an interrogation are vulnerable because they treat that interrogation as an opportunity to try to engage, to tell their story. And when these accusatorial or confrontational techniques are used that are likely to induce false confessions, they become vulnerable, right? They become more vulnerable. I should say, too, innocent people are significantly more likely to waive Miranda compared with guilty, right? And we should also note in the paper, we've learned so much more about Miranda over the past few years. There's a terrific section on Miranda rights and the challenges with them. But this evidence-based suspicion is an idea that we want to have a reasonable suspicion and stronger evidence before we place someone into a vulnerable position who may be, in fact, innocent, which is a risk factor, right? So thinking critically about who we subject interrogation techniques to can reduce the likelihood that we get false confessions.
I think one of the really important pieces there for people to take away that maybe aren't familiar with how this has changed over the years, but evidence-based suspicion. So what is triggering me to be suspicious of somebody is not based off of the fact that they look to the left and to the right and sneeze three times.
That's right. It has nothing to do with the context of the interview.
Okay.
It has everything to do with what you knew before you decided to interview them, right? And let's also talk about the notion that there's different types of evidence which vary in their diagnosticity. Some evidence is more likely to point towards true guilt than other evidence, right? So snitches, jailhouse informants, calls from anonymous tip lines. These are all things that have lower diagnostic value than video-based or even some forms of testimonial-based evidence, and certainly some forms of forensic evidence, which carry greater weight that the individual was at the scene of the crime, may have been involved in the action alleged, and therefore a higher likelihood of guilt. One of the things that we really try to do these days is to remind investigators about the variation in evidence that they have and what it's actually telling them, and to encourage them to be critical of each piece of evidence, just like they're critical of the subject's statements in an interview.
And a jury to be just as skeptical would be helpful. I got three more of these that, and again, there's a lot of this in the paper to expand on, but high level, limits on confrontational approaches. And I know we've kind of alluded to some of this throughout, but any more suggestions or takeaways for what
I think we really just want to reduce the use of certain accusatorial practices, including minimization techniques that imply leniency, theme-based, right? The use of presentation of false evidence and deception in interviews. We know that these are problematic. And so encouraging the disuse of those techniques in favor of, we're going to give you some other things
that work better. And that's what I think is really interesting. I know, Chris, when you presented at the Elite Training Days conference last year, and I saw you present it at IRG, the International Investigative Interviewing Research Group conference with Susan Brandon, and seeing the more efficient results of getting more reliable information using the better tool. Why wouldn't we do that? So I think that's good. Another one here, and this one I kind of direct towards Hayley, about protecting youth and other vulnerabilities. And I know we talked about the risk factors. What is that looking like from a practitioner's perspective? What are some things that we're recommending or they should keep in mind if they're interviewing somebody who's vulnerable?
Sure. So I think that context matters, right? And by context matters, I mean, are we talking about a criminal interview versus, a private sector investigation? Are we talking about a U.S.-based criminal interview versus, systems in Canada or Europe or somewhere else? Because our legal systems differ. In the United States, our legal system is adversarial. And so in that context, there's really no adequate substitute that we have structurally in place better than mandatory assistance of counsel for people who are, for young people or people who have cognitive limitations. And I fully recognize that that might be an unpopular recommendation for some folks because there's a perception that attorneys might hinder the investigative process. But knowing what we know about these developmentally driven and, other types of neurobiological, neurodiversity related vulnerabilities, there needs to be a qualified, appropriate adult. Right. So in the UK, they have an appropriate adult system where people are specially trained to advocate for the suspect, to intervene if things become stressful or overwhelming. There are versions of that here in the US, but given the nature of our adversarial system and its structure, at least when we're talking about young people, mandatory assistance of counsel, support by a legally trained person is really the best path forward at this juncture.
Legally trained, and you said qualified. Does that mean parents probably aren't the best person to be in the room?
Do we have 3 more hours to talk on this podcast about parents? Uh, we cannot assume that parents certainly have a legal right to be involved in their children's lives and a moral and social right as well. And I think we have to be careful about assuming that parents are always appropriately situated to protect their children. There's a lot of research that shows that sometimes parents are either unable or unwilling in certain circumstances to advocate for their youth or to compensate for their kids' legal limitations or developmental vulnerabilities. And so parents are not a one-size-fits-all approach, and while they deserve to be involved, they're no adequate substitute for a
Yeah,
lawyer.
I think that's important, not just for investigators to learn, but anybody that's listening who thinks it's in their best interest to protect their child during this process. You may be doing them a disservice if you don't have the right guidance. The last one I wanted to highlight, and I saved this one because I think it's really a culmination of all of this. I know, Chris, you talked about rapport and trust. There's concepts of how do we elicit information better? How do we do a kind of a cognitive credibility assessment versus detecting deception and physical behavior? But all of this to me falls under the umbrella of just science-based interviewing. And that's really where we're moving. So maybe we can kind of wrap up with this recommendation, but what does that look like?
Yeah,
and what does that
we now have
science-based
5-day courses that are training science-based interviewing approaches, right? We have a suite of techniques that cover every relevant area. And that doesn't mean that we won't innovate more and see more of that development of what works. But we have a very good model now, shown to be effective, not only in the lab, but in the field, right? That research has walked it from the lab to the field. All of the techniques that we've kind of talked about today, from thinking about mindset and countering those confirmation biases that are natural processes, to developing rapport and increasingly a new literature, an emerging literature on trust and how it's distinct from rapport, to asking good questions and thinking about, we often don't talk about memory when it comes to suspect interrogations. But in fact, where is all the information coming from? It's coming from the individual's memory of their experiences. And if you want to get at that information, you need to understand the best ways to ask productive and mnemonic memory-based questioning to elicit that information. We have an emerging understanding of what resistance is and why it happens, and an emerging research on how to effectively confront with accusations of inconsistency or guilt or deception. And we have a terrific literature on how to present evidence strategically, thoughtfully, and with reference to things like proximity to the crime or perceptions of, guilt that it leans towards. We also have, as you mentioned, these cognitive credibility tools. Not only can we improve your ability to assess deception, but in fact, in order to do that, we have to change the way that you interview. And my colleagues and I like to say, everything in the model of science-based interviewing works together and towards a common goal, right? When I change the way that you interview, I now avail you to the very best cues to deception. But you have to interview in productive ways that allow the subject to talk, because the very best cues to deception have to do with the way that people tell their stories. If you want to assess deception, let them talk. But let me offer this caveat. We have nothing in the deception literature that will make you 90% accurate, 80% accurate. The best we could probably do is around 70, 75%. And so when I talk to practitioners about this research, what I want you to do is lower your confidence, but increase your competence in looking for the right cues, right? It's critical that you do so. Approach it with some skepticism and understand that you're not going to be perfect at assessing credibility.
Yeah, that's a great takeaway. The last piece you said there, the way we interview is going to change somebody's behavior, right? I mean, even the confrontational piece, the word choice, and it's funny to watch, but when an interviewer is direct or accusatory or says something and that provokes somebody's behavior, and then the interviewer reacts to that behavior as they must be guilty. Exactly. And really interesting. You did mention memory, so I have to plug this. I was lucky enough to have Dr. Elizabeth Loftus on earlier this season. So if you're interested more in memory and how trauma impacts memory, just how we retrieve information, she's definitely one of the foundational researchers on that area. So I would check that episode out. Before we wrap up, because I know we're going for a while, but there's so much good information for people. So I highly recommend people click in the show notes, and we'll have the link. Check out this paper and all the different references that are there. I also recommend following Hayley, connecting it with Chris and Hayley on LinkedIn or any other channel, just to kind of see the research. And I know you're both really active in the practitioner space and always out there presenting, so I recommend people to follow that. But I'll give you each just some space if you have any kind of one last maybe takeaway that you hope people either get from the paper or just from the conversation we've had all together. And Hayley, I'll pass it off to you if you've got kind of one last truth for our listeners.
My one last truth would be we're on the same team, right? Interrogation researchers and investigators want the same thing, which is to arrive at the right answer and avoid the wrong answer. And, in the context, at least of criminal interviewing, the consequences of getting it wrong are extraordinary. And they're disproportionately loaded toward certain groups of people, right, who are systematically disadvantaged. And so we're on the same team, which means we need to talk together, we need to work together, we need to trust one another, we need to show up to these conversations with curiosity and humility. And I think that will really lay the foundation for continuing to innovate and making interviewing practices more reliable.
Fantastic. Let me focus on this. When I used to do training early on, I'd get practitioners coming up to me saying, "Hey doc, that was great. I really appreciate being able to add something to my toolbox." I didn't appreciate that metaphor and what they were saying until later on. Here's the problem with adding something to your toolbox. Do you keep tools in your toolbox that are broken? Do you keep tools in your toolbox that don't work for its intended purpose, or that damage rather than fix something? What we need is not for you to add to your toolbox. What we need is for you to throw away the tools that don't work and to understand that there's a new toolbox with science-based tools available to you that have been shown to be effective. And we need for you, let me continue the metaphor, to keep coming to the hardware store to look for the new tools that are being built and designed. And in fact, if you don't mind, reach out to the engineers and scientists that are developing the tools. Work with them when you see a problem that is in need of a tool to help develop and design that tool. That's what we need going forward. We need an innovative entrepreneurial approach to building a better toolbox and building better tools that facilitate the incredibly challenging, difficult job that investigators do every day.
Both perfect takeaways, and I like the metaphor. I'm gonna just give this message to practitioners because you both did a good job earlier talking about how the scholarly community can be better, maybe open-minded in their approach, or I think humility was the word you both used. From a practitioner standpoint, I mean, same concept, but I would also say, reach out. It's fascinating that if you have a question, you want to know if something works or if you're not doing it right, or there's a better way to do it, you want to test, have a proof of concept, even just reaching out to your local university or one of these associations, right? American Psychology and Law, you get all these different groups where there are researchers and doctoral candidates and students that are just will salivate over the idea of, hey, we've got data, we want to figure out if this works. Do you know how? And it's just, I've had so many just really neat conversations and opportunities where students and professors have said, let's study it. Let's take what you have and let's figure out if it works. And it's just a really neat process to be a part of. So I challenge practitioners that just because it says PhD doesn't mean you can't email them. So
Oh, yeah. We are regular people.
they
We
love
are not
yeah.
as interesting or scary as we might look.
When
Please.
you see the citation at the end of a paper and you or the authors reach out, because in my experience, just like the two of you have been so giving here, people want the research to live and breathe and be applied. So I recommend practitioners to do that. But thank you both so much for spending some time with me and helping all the work. I know this has been years of work to get this paper put together. We just try to encapsulate it in an hour, but thanks for helping spread the message and making a practitioner's job easier along the way.
Thanks to you.
Thanks everybody listening for this episode of Truth Be Told.
To help more listeners find our show, please provide us a rating, give us a follow, and share this episode with your colleagues. For the latest news and to engage with our guests, follow Truth Be Told on your favorite social media apps. And don't forget, we are available on all major platforms, including Apple, Spotify, and watch a video of this episode on YouTube. On behalf of our guests and valued sponsors, thanks again for listening to this episode of Truth Be Told.
The IAI is proud to announce the release of the latest version of the CFY program. This learning program is comprised of nearly 90% new and improved content. The updated educational program is informed by international conventions governing the conduct of investigative interviews and guided by the PEACE best practices model for these activities. Visit us today at w-z.com to learn more.